Hey guys, in this video I'd like to share some insights relating to practicing the piano and how to practice more effectively and more intentionally, and how to waste less time and get more done in less time, and how to have more fruitful practice sessions. And it comes back to how we think about practice. And so these are things that I think a beginner should consider, but even advanced pianists should consider and remind themselves of often. Like I have to remind myself of this often, because the way to practice really effectively is not always intuitive. In fact, the way we like to practice is typically practicing until something's perfect, right? I'm sure you've heard that saying, practice until perfect. But when you think about how that works on the piano, you play something a bunch of times until you get it right and you move on. Well, you know that's no good because your number of desirable repetitions are not going to outnumber the undesirable ones, okay? And then when you go to perform and you got some pressure on you, it's like picking a lottery ticket or something as to which version of the passage that you have like floating around in your head, which one's going to come out on performance day. Well, it's probably going to be the one you did the most, and it's going to be the one that is the most habitual. So I'd like to hone in on this idea of practice makes perfect, and I'd like you to consider flipping that around. Make something perfect first, and then practice it. So in this situation, I would be distinguishing between learning something and practicing it. And in this case, I'm thinking about practicing as repeating, as securing, right? Where you play something and you play it a few times and then you sleep on it and then you try it again the next day and you sleep on it and you try it again the next day, right? That's practicing and securing, and you're doing that through repetition. You're doing that through creative practice and engaging practice and all that stuff, right? But you have to actually like set aside some time to learn, and you have to be really careful about how you learn because your mind's like always recording and it's always absorbing. And just because you practice does not mean you're guaranteed to get better. You're just going to get better at what you practice. So if you got some wrong notes, you're going to get very confident with those wrong notes. And if you've got some wrong rhythms, same thing. So your practice needs to reflect how you want the final piece to sound. So I'd like to offer you three simple ways. You know these things, but I just want to put it to you this way. 3 ways to reduce the difficulty of things you're working on, and 3 ways to increase the chance that you are accurate from day one and that you have all of the musicality that you need from day one, okay? Because you have to actually prioritize these things. You need to make your version of the piece, your passage, be like the one you want to perform. So the first tip, the most obvious one, is to slow down. Like, seriously, slow down. Everybody should probably be doing everything slower. You know, of course, there's a bottom as to how slow you can go, right? But if you are making mistakes at whatever tempo you are playing at, that's unlikely to resolve at that same tempo. It's not going, like the wrong notes aren't going to suddenly right themselves, okay? At some point, you've got to get control of the thing that you're working on and play the right notes and do it enough times in a short enough amount of time that your brain latches onto it and autonomizes it, okay? That's the whole idea, is you want to autonomize your practice and make it to where you don't need to think consciously about everything that you're doing, okay? So slow down, and if you're playing a passage on the piano, you want to go slow enough where you can be fully present in all of the musical details, and you want to always be able to think about what the next idea is before you get to it, okay? Which means that you need to be able to think faster than your pulse. You got to be able to think faster than you're moving. And if you have hesitations, if you've got pauses, that's basically your mind saying, like, processing, you know? It's just like it's a loading screen for your mind. You're not ready to play the next idea yet because your brain hasn't conjured it up, okay? So slow the tempo down and try to absorb that in the natural pulse, and, you know, see if you can get your head and your hands around your music by going slower. And I remember, as I've studied with various teachers, people that are way better than me, whenever I spend some time away from a teacher that I'm working with on a piece, and I'm practicing it, I'm doing what I feel is slow, and then I get into the lesson, I'm having some trouble. So, you know, they'll help me out a little bit. And their example of how slow I should go is like always substantially slower than I was thinking. It didn't even occur to me to go that slow, okay? So you want to be creative about how slow you might go, but you want to be aggressive with it too, because you want to get to where you can play the thing correctly at some tempo as fast as possible. All right, the next tip is to obviously split the hands apart when you're dealing with the piano stuff, okay? unless you're at the point where you know both hands independently of whatever it is that you're working on, and you need to put the hands together, right? That's the next step. Well, then you can't use this particular tool. You'll have to use other ones. But if you haven't done this, if it's a complicated piece especially, or if you're not familiar and you can't just straight up sight read it, don't try to do it on both hands and actually start practicing that. Because when you play something like one hand and then the other, that makes things a lot easier to get the actual music in your head. You can count out loud and let your counting represent what the other hand would be doing while you actually play. And while you play one hand at a time, you have less to think about. And when you put your hands together, it's not twice as hard because there's two hands. It's like 10 times as hard because of all of the interaction between the hands. So definitely be sure to run passages one hand at a time. And you can bring one-handed practice up to performance tempo or even past it to really push the limits. And you'll be able to do that a lot earlier on in the learning process compared to if you just put your hands together from the start. So include some hand separate practice in your practice as one of the main tools so that you can get things correct and get the essence of the musical line that you're working on absorbed faster. And then the last thing, and this is something that I noticed that a lot of folks don't do that they should, is narrow the scope of what you're working on. Think of your working memory being like 10 to 15 seconds or so of material before you start to forget what the beginning is of whatever you were just working on, okay? So like short amounts of material when you're doing repetitions and you are trying to, like focus on a particular idea, right? So try not to be thinking about too many things at once. You don't necessarily need to be like, oh, I'm going to play 4 measures or I'm going to play 2 measures or, it's not a particular number. I like to go based off of the phrase or based off of whatever the logical idea is in the music, but basically chop it up a little bit, okay? Don't be playing huge sections, especially if you're new at a passage and you have to go really, really slowly and it takes you forever to get a repetition of that passage. Well, then that's too big. The scope's not narrow enough. You are not going to, it's going to be like, I always say, like mowing a football field with like a little hand mower or something. It's going to take forever. So you want to narrow the scope of what you're working on. And so when you think about how these 3 tools can work together, slow down, split the hands up, narrow the scope, right? You don't need to apply all 3 at the same time. So for example, if you have already learned your hands separate on your music and you're pretty solid with it, well, first of all, you want to kind of take the hand separate tool off the table because we want to put our hands together. Well, then you have 2 other things you can think about. You can slow the tempo down, or you can narrow the scope, or you can do a little bit of both. Generally, the more the scope is narrowed, like the fewer measures that you practice, the faster you'll be able to play what you're focused on. And of course, the more you try to work on at once, the slower you're going to need to go in order to think about what all of the next ideas are. Okay? And of course, the opposite is true. So if you want to work on more material, you might slow down a little bit to compensate, but you can use either one of these tools when you don't want to split your hands up. And then when you're trying to raise the tempo on something, well, if you do split the hands up, you can raise the tempo a lot easier on each hand individually and get those hands autonomous first, and then try putting them together when you don't have to think about it. You don't have to baby it so much. So think of these 3 tools, reducing the tempo, splitting your hands up, and narrowing the scope of what you're working on, and use them in order to put yourself in a position where you are playing material as you intend to play it in performance as early on in the learning process as possible. And you'll have to switch back and forth between what you're doing. You don't need to necessarily use all 3 things, although you can. And the more you lean on one tool, the less you'll have to lean on the other tools. And this is basically how I think about practice. Okay? So I hope this is helpful. If you need me to elaborate on any of these things further, or perhaps offer you some examples in music, I'm happy to do that. But I just wanted to give you something to think about, because I think that we often practice until something's perfect by default, especially when we are not actually focused on being intentional with our practice. And that's definitely not the way to go, especially if you're busy. Like the busier you are, the more your practice time counts, and the more these things need to be kind of top of mind. So be very intentional with your practice. Use the 3 tools to make sure that you're getting the highest accuracy, the best, like the most accurate rhythm, the most accurate notes, the best musical interpretation for your music, and hopefully your practice will be fruitful. And I hope you find this helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.